to think about that. It's a
Yeah.
good question. I think there were stages. It didn't all happen at once.
Okay.
Yeah. When did my heart embrace? Well, I would divide into when did my heart embrace recovery and when did my heart embrace recovery movement.
Correct. Yes.
So I first had to go through a certain amount of my own recovery to even feel that I could do something, that I could offer something, give back. And so I'd say probably in my second hospitalization, I was locked in seclusion. Well, what happened, I'll give you a brief little vignette of what happened.
Okay.
So I was working at the time, ironically, as a biochemist at the National Institute of Mental Health,
Okay.
which was located across the highway from where I was hospitalized. It was in the National Institute of Mental Health building in Bethesda.
Mm-hmm.
I was in one of the many buildings there in the laboratory. And then I was hospitalized in Bethesda Naval Hospital, right across the street, because I was in the public health service at the time. It was 1970. And I was in the hospital for several months. I was hospitalized because I stopped going to work, and I stopped talking. I stopped eating. I didn't see any reason to go on living, really. But I couldn't take my life. So I just said stop to myself. Stop, stop. And gradually in the hospital, I started to relate, and actually probably my recovery began with the nonverbal connecting that the least trained people were able to do with me in the hospital.
Okay.
The corpsmen. So in the hospital, you have a whole hierarchy going up to the psychiatrist, and there's social workers, nurses. But at the very beginning, at the very, like right at the lowest point of the hierarchy, are the corpsmen. They're just young guys. Yeah, they were all guys, probably 18, 19, 20 years old.
Okay.
They've had a little bit of training on how to help people medically, but they're not formally psychiatrically trained or clinically trained, which I think is a good thing. So I didn't want to talk because I didn't feel safe with the professional staff, with the nurses or the doctors. And they give me medication and they try,
Watch you take it.
watch me take it and try to get me to talk, and I just didn't feel safe. But the corpsmen, there were a couple of corpsmen that non-verbally started to relate to me. They didn't demand that I talk. And I think that started my recovery in a way, was feeling like there were people out there that I could connect with. And they were very good-hearted. So I started to embrace, and I call it recovery of my life, recovering my life, because I'd given up on my life.
And you could embrace that energy, which is that common?
Well, they had a light in them that I could feel. They had a caring that I could feel, and I can remember, like the very first time I went to the emergency room. I was taken to the emergency room because I wasn't doing anything at home. I had roommates and they were scared. So they brought me to the Bethesda Naval Hospital emergency room. And as my psychiatrist said, that's where I have to get treated, because I was in the public health service.
Okay.
And they dropped, my roommates dropped me off with I had no identification on me. So just my clothes, and that was it. And I wasn't talking. And they left, because they were scared. It was, the Vietnam War, and there was a lot of, worry about the military. And so they left me there, and they didn't know what to do in the emergency room. They tried all the questions with clipboards, and this is why I mention to people now, whenever you're with somebody who's in acute distress, try not to ask questions, because questions feel like an attack, when you're feeling really vulnerable. You can relate to that,
Yes.
I guess. Yeah. And but they and I wasn't moving, so they put me in a wheelchair and they just moved me to the side of the emergency room. This guy came over. He was a corpsman, as far as I could tell, and he just looked at me. And he looked a little longer, and I don't know how long he looked. It might have been 5 minutes. It might have been 30 minutes. And he said, "I can tell you're uncomfortable. My name's Rick. If you can hear me, just nod." I nodded. But that was the first time I really felt like I could connect again. And then, gradually on the unit, I started to connect with some of the corpsmen there. Again, the least formally trained. I think it's because their heart is open.
Okay.
They haven't gotten trained to close their heart. And unfortunately, psychiatric and mental health training closes people's heart often, which is the most important part of your helping other people is your heart.
Yeah.
So I then I went over to my lab because I got a pass, and then when I came back, they asked me how I felt, and I said on a scale of 1 to 10, I felt 11. And you should never do something like that in a hospital. Shouldn't in a hospital say that you're outside of the range.
Right. Up or down.
Yeah, designated range.
Yeah.
It should be within normal limits.
A 5.
Yeah, that'd be very safe. That'd have been a good answer. So they put me in seclusion right away.
Okay.
Because that tended and still often is the treatment if somebody seems manic, which is the worst idea again, because I was yearning for connection.
Yeah.
And there I was isolated. So in seclusion though is when I also started to sort of find deep inside myself the belief I could get out of it, could finish, could recover. And it was two things that happened. One was I imagined my sort of spirit flying out the window to freedom, like a bird, like a blue bird flying through the window. So I freed my spirit, and then I had another thought, and that was if I ever get the hell out of here, I'm going to get the keys and let everybody out of a psychiatric hospital. And then I passed out. I passed out.
Wow.
And when I came to, I was out of seclusion, but that was a terrible experience. I really don't think people should be in seclusion, and certainly not in a hospital. So I played the game and I got out. But I continued on my plan, which was to become a psychiatrist.
Okay.
So, well, who holds the keys? The psychiatrist holds the keys. Psychiatrist determines when you leave and when you don't leave. So I'll be a psychiatrist, and I'll get the keys, and I'll change the system. And that energy, that enthusiasm has stayed with me. I had to get allies along the way, though. And one was my therapist. He was a psychiatrist. He was very interpersonal. And he was very willing to go along with this idea that I could be a psychiatrist, which was really unusual. If somebody's been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that's what I was handed on my way out of the hospital. You are schizophrenic. That's all. The first time I heard it, like, oh shit, I've got the diagnosis.
Did you even know what it was?
Oh yeah, I'd been working in the laboratory on supposed chemical basis of schizophrenia. I'm like, oh my God, I've got the condition that I've been studying. And I knew that at that point people, 1970, everyone was still believing no one recovered. I mean, now there's still a lot of people that believe that falsely, but then it was practically everybody. But luckily my psychiatrist is not one of them. He was terrific. And so he said, and I'll be at your graduation. It's like, and he did come 6 years later. Came to my graduation.
That's
he always
awesome.
was in my corner. Yeah, he was terrific. I went and saw him about 4 years ago because I've been working on a book trying to piece together what helped and what didn't help in my recovery.
Right.
I call the book Heartbeats of Hope. Heartbeats of Hope. And it's about how people can recover through empowerment. People can recover in their lives. I went to interview him. His name is Dr. Simshishin. He was from Eastern Europe.
Okay.
And my mother used to joke, what kind of name is that? Sounds like a magical incantation. Simshishin. She was a little bit narrow in her.
Yeah, it's right up there with Rick Van Winkle.
Yeah, unusual word names. Yeah. So I told him, in this interview, I asked him, what were you thinking when you were treating me? Because you always seemed to believe in me, and you always, whenever you come up with like an insight, you'd say that you got it from me, and you were so empowering, and he was just so right there. And he said, well, I believe that that regression, like going into psychosis, can be healing. And he said, that's what I felt for you, that it was healing, actually. So he always had a positive view of psychosis, that it was healing. And he had gotten that, he'd been a psychiatrist in Vietnam, and he'd seen people go into psychosis and then come out. So he had that faith and hope. And he gave me hope, really. And the third time I was hospitalized during medical school, too. I got into medical school, but it was a lot of pressure, medical school.
Oh, I can only imagine.
And I foolishly, and no one said, no, don't try that, decided I wanted to get through in 3 years. So I had to do double the course load the first year. And so I went into, that other reality again. Mm-hmm. And when I was in the hospital, he came and saw me. He wasn't even my psychiatrist then, but somehow people found him. And I said, I think I've got a permanent brain disorder. This is the third time this has happened.
Right. And
he said, I think you're perfectly fine. I think your brain is healthy. You've just had traumas and you're going to get through them. That was very, very important that people hear that. And so he gave me hope, and then I was the next sort of how did you put it? How did I embrace recovery in my heart?
Yeah.
How did I embrace recovery in my heart?
The
recovery movement.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the recovery movement, I didn't really discover that until I was in medical school, and I got this newspaper. And never underestimate the importance of newsletters or newspapers. So I think it's great you're doing this.
Excellent.
So it was out of, there I was in Washington, D.C., reading a newspaper that was put out in San Francisco by Leonard Roy Frank and Wade Hudson. And it was like 1973, and it was called the Madness Network News. Madness Network News, and it was put out by the Network Against Psychiatric Assault. That was the name of their group. And in it they started to talk about rights and the movement that was starting, and they talked about a group in Boston called the Mental Patient Liberation Front. And liberation is such an essential part of our movement, really, is to become liberated and to have our rights. And so when I came to residency, looking at a residency in 1976, I thought Boston is where I want to go, because there wasn't any group in D.C. like that.
Okay.
But in Boston, I said to myself, I'll get training during the day in becoming a psychiatrist, but by night I'll get trained to be an activist. Yeah. advocate. Yeah, and I was telling Jim though, the funny thing that happened was I wrote this group, and I said I'm coming there. I want to join your group. I've had my experience as an ex-patient, is what we called ourselves then.
Oh, okay.
Not consumer, not survivor, but ex-patient. And I says, I want to join your group, but I am also going to be in training to become a psychiatrist. They said, you can't come to our group.
Because you were going to train to be a
psychiatrist, yeah. You'll be part of the enemy.
Oh, it goes both ways. That's nice.
Yeah, it goes both ways. So I was telling Jim, gradually I came up and started my training, and every pupil that come up to me in the unit, consumers, people with lived experience, they'd say, we know who you are. We won't tell anyone. Mm-hmm. Kept it a secret. But then they formed a group called Friends of the MPLF, Friends of the Mental Patient Liberation Front. So, and then I met this woman, Judy Chamberlain, and she and the group really inspired me to embrace the recovery movement. It was really, it's now a recovery movement. It was at that point more liberation movement. Okay. Because it was really primarily about rights.
And this was still in 1976?
78.
78, okay.
A couple years later.
All right.
And also through that group, I came to realize it was possible to have a family. Because I didn't think I could have a family. And I met my wife-to-be. She came up to Boston with me, and she was a very important part of my recovery. In fact, I've said to her not so long ago, what were you thinking? What were you thinking going out with a guy that had been diagnosed with schizophrenia? She was just 24 when I met her. I was 30. And
did you say fascinating?
No. Fascinating. She said, I never thought you were sick. I never saw you as being sick. Never saw it. And she always sort of looked to the positive side. She was very good about not saying, well, did you get enough sleep? I mean, she does worry. Sometimes I don't get enough sleep, but she doesn't like make a big case about it. And I was interviewed, like, I don't know, maybe it was in the 80s, late 80s. We had children. We have 2 daughters. Very proud of them.
And today is what?
And today is my younger daughter's birthday. Yeah.
What was yesterday then?
Yesterday is my older daughter's birthday. Yeah.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday. Caitlin, my older, and Lauren, my younger daughter. Yeah. Yeah. So she, but my wife, she was very, very much there all the time, and very, very much believed in me. And I was interviewed by CNN. I don't know. It was probably in the early 90s. They interviewed me. They interviewed her.
Wow.
They interviewed. They wanted to interview my daughters, but they didn't want to. They're just 8 and 10. There's like a long distance shot of one of my daughters showing. I was taking one of my daughters to the bus stop, but my wife, when they interviewed her, at one point they said, "Do you worry about your husband, getting sick again?" And she said, "Actually, I rely on him more than he relies on me."
There you go.
So, and I played a lot of role with raising our children, because I felt like I wish my parents had been around more when I was growing up. And they were kind of preoccupied. I was the third of 4 children, and it was children to be seen, not heard type of thing. And but I got more and more. I was involved a little bit in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s with MPLF, and then my main work was with raising my children for the next 10 years. But then in 92, I and Judy Chamberlain, she's really, who has been until her death 5 years ago, my mentor, even though she was younger than me, but she saw these truths very early and wrote a wonderful book I really recommend called On Our Own. On Our Own.
Okay.
And the subtitle of it is Ex-Patient Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System. Well, that really laid the foundation for a lot of the consumer movement and the recovery
All the light
movement.
bulbs are going off. Yeah.
Yeah. We really, I think then starting in 92, she and I and Patricia Deegan and a woman named Laurie Ahern, we started the National Empowerment Center. We'd been working at Boston University Center for Psych Rehab. There's a guy named Bill Anthony who was he was really helpful too. But there were little helpers along the line. He said, here's a grant, why don't you all apply?
Really?
Yeah, it was for a technical assistance center. We didn't have any idea that we were going to do something like that. I was, at the time, working as a psychiatrist in a community mental health center.
Okay.
So I went along a fairly traditional route. I thought if I could just get inside the system, I could really change it. Mm-hmm. And I didn't realize that, like you go to reach for the keys to let people out, and there are about 5 or 6 people saying, just a minute, not so quick.
Right.
There's the head of the hospital, because I worked in a hospital for a while. Mm-hmm. There's the parents, no, we're not ready to have them home. There's the community, treatment team, no, can't do it yet. There's the head nurse on the unit. What are you doing? You can't let this person out.
Yeah.
So you can't, as an individual, really change the system. Mm-hmm. It has to be done as a movement and a whole group of people working together. So that's a long answer.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
You look like you have another question.
I have 2 more.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll try to be a little briefer on this.
Oh, okay. We love it. We love it. Just lay it on us. Okay. Do you feel you would have such a strong belief in the recovery movement if you didn't have a mental health diagnosis? In other words, do you feel you would even have become a psychiatrist and or be more of a medical maintenance model type of doctor? How much did the impact?
No, it made a huge difference. I mean, my lived experience. My lived experience of being labeled and recovering my life played a very important role in my decision to become a psychiatrist. As I said, it happened, the decision occurred to me, or the vision, while I was hospitalized, and I stuck with it. Mm-hmm. Partly because I could just see other people were suffering too. Mm-hmm. In terms of being a traditional, no, I couldn't have been a traditional psychiatrist, and it wasn't that I went into the field just to be an advocate, but my identity was formed really prior to my becoming a psychiatrist. So my first identity and my first love, in a way, is the movement. That's right. Psychiatry comes second. And I mean, I practice. I worked in all the different settings, traditional settings. I was medical director of a community mental health center. Okay. And I worked as the psychiatrist on a inpatient unit for one of the units at Danvers State Hospital. And I worked at a day treatment center. I worked with elderly people, and I did a lot of those sort of somewhat more traditional activities. Okay. Always with an eye, though, of bringing recovery in and bringing, new ideas and hope to people. Yeah, really hope. Hope is very essential, and it makes me very angry that so often hope is taken away from people.
Not even considered.
No, I know. The worst thing that can be told to somebody when they're suffering is you won't get better. That's horrible, because you need every ounce of hope that you can find from others,
just to fight.
Yourself, to fight. That's right, just to fight. So I've been working, put together several different programs to try to retrain everybody
And look at how many people you've reached over the years, though.
Well, I've reached a lot of people, but I want to
All
reach
over the
more.
world.
I want to more than reach them. I want them really to learn.
Get it.
Yeah, I want them to learn different ways. And so we did something called the PACE program,
Yes.
Personal Assistance and Community Existence, which really was, I saw that as spreading the idea that people could recover.
Okay.
And then
that came first.
that was first. PACE came first, yeah. And I did that with our co-director at the time. Her name was Laurie Hearn, and she was very, very good about sort of highlighting the importance of recovery. I knew it was important, but she just underlined it. And she now works in internationally on rights of people with psychiatric problems internationally.
Oh, okay.
But then after PACE, I was on the White House Commission for Mental Health. And I was the only labeled person. There were others that had
Right, yeah.
they had their emotional problems probably, but I was the only
They
one
had
who
their
was
titles
labeled. Yeah, right. They had their titles, and there were 15 of us. And I asked the guy who was director of SAMHSA afterwards, Charlie Curry. I said, Charlie, how did you pick me? Because I was more of an activist and more progressive than a lot of the other leaders in our movement. And he said, you have a psychiatric degree, so I knew you could stand toe-to-toe with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I had to do.
Yep.
I had to do that. I had to stand up for...
Not always comfortable with it.
No, with millions of people. They would say remission is possible. I'd say, no, people recover.
Mm-hmm.
It's not remission. People recover a full life. They're like, wow, how is that possible? I say, look at me.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of me?
Yeah.
They go, oh.
Yeah, were you faking it before? You know what I mean? Hello.
No, some people do say I was misdiagnosed, but
No.
I've proven I fit the criteria.
Yes.
This is a whole other topic, but as an aside, I think the label of schizophrenia should be eliminated completely. And I'm not alone in that. There are 4 Far Eastern countries now that have eliminated the term schizophrenia, the label schizophrenia. Japan was the first, Hong Kong, South Korea, and most recently Taiwan. And I was invited to Taiwan last year to a renaming ceremony.
Really? 2?
Well, the new title doesn't sound so terrific, but it's less stigmatizing, they feel, and that and it's only in Chinese. They can't say it in English because they said they've only changed the label in Chinese.
Okay.
They recognize that in English it's still there as schizophrenia. Cognitive perceptual dysregulation.
It's a mouthful.
And the reason for that,
Just to baffle people.
Well,
so they don't ask.
well, they feel it's something you can recover from. A dysregulation, you can become regulated. Yeah, yeah. Whereas schizophrenia, when you translate it into
Hopelessness.
well, not only that, in Chinese it's split brain.
Oh.
Schizophrenia, split brain. So that sounds very permanent.
It does.
Yeah, and so there's no evidence, by the way, that these are permanent biological problems. No evidence to that effect. But that's a long-winded answer to your question.
That's okay, but it leads me right into my next one.
Oh, okay.
Little did I know. Okay, what is your take on stigma, and why do you think it's taking so long for the general public to embrace recovery and the use of how hurtful stigma is?
Embrace those of us that have been labeled too.
Yeah.
To overcome, well, stigma, it's interesting. There are people in our movement, and I'm sort of two minds on it because I kind of straddle this question. There are people in our movement that would like to eliminate the term stigma because it's only used in mental health. So that then means that the term becomes stigmatizing. A lot of people feel we should just use prejudice so that it's then related to any way that people are discriminated against. Prejudice is people's attitudes. Discrimination is the legal status, that we're given lower legal status. So we're subjected to both prejudice and discrimination. The media is probably the worst offender. And very recent example just happened a couple weeks ago. The Boston Globe Spotlight team, which was the movie Spotlight was based upon them, and they did a great job of exposing the child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. It started in Boston. That's where they exposed it, and now they of course have found it all over the country and all over the world. And I was subjected not by a priest but by a teacher to sexual abuse when I was 10. So I know how terrible that is, and I was very grateful they did it. I still thought about like pressing charges against the teacher. I know where he is. I know where he lives. But in any event, stigma by the Spotlight team, they highlighted violence and mental health, and that is just sets us back so far.
Yeah.
The equating of violence and mental health problems. Majority of people that are diagnosed with a mental health issue are nonviolent. I mean, I never had significant violence. I did one time on the street, and I was arrested when it happened. I pushed a woman because I thought that her cross actually was interfering with her life, but I was apprehended. That's when I was hospitalized the third time. So, but people get angry at times, a variety of circumstances, and the biggest vulnerability actually is substance use. I wasn't drinking at the time, but alcohol and drug abuse are more likely lead to violence than mental illness. And people who are labeled with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime and of violence. And actually, I was held up at gunpoint 2 different occasions during my less than well-oriented ways. Because I think when you don't have your wits about you, your senses about you, you're preoccupied, you're a target. People can see that, and they're more likely to pounce upon you, bully you, push you around. So,
it's something we emit.
yeah. But stigma and discrimination, or prejudice and discrimination, second big source of it is the mental health system itself, the labeling. I think we do a big disservice by putting diagnostic labels on people. I think we ought to do away with the whole diagnostic system.
Okay.
Description, yes. It's helpful for me to know that, at times of stress, I tend to become quiet or withdrawn, or, start to wonder about, my future, or, because of various circumstances that happen in my life, or that combined with my character. Okay, I can buy that. And that what I need to do is to be more in contact with people. But to call that schizophrenia makes it too much into just a chemical problem, and then say it's a chemical problem. So I think the mental health system needs to re-examine itself and be more humanistic, not treat people as objects, not have so much forced treatment. Being forcibly treated is very stigmatizing.
Yeah, it is.
You're treated as an object, you're put into a hospital against your will, and you're not...
There's needles coming at you.
Needles coming at you, yeah. So I think that if we describe the problems differently, if we gave more hope, I think stigma and discrimination come from lack of hope too. I gave a talk one time to a group of judges. There's so many. I mean, it was nice you were saying, I think it's true, I've reached a lot of people. There are a whole large number of people also that I haven't reached, like judges and teachers and a lot of, and parents, a lot of authorities who they still haven't been ready to hear this message of recovery, and they just don't believe it, that people can recover. And so I gave, several years ago, Sherry Mead, who's just an excellent, she helped develop intentional peer support, and she developed the first peer run respite, and Yeah, she's excellent. She's sadly has Parkinson's at this point and can't get out. Her partner Chris Hansen does a lot of the work. But in any event, Sherry Mead organized about 10 years ago a conference for judges and for other criminal justice officials, probation officers, prosecuting attorneys, is in New Hampshire. And she wanted me to keynote about recovery. And I said, that's interesting. I mean, these are mostly probate judges, and they're mostly involved in child custody. Okay. Who's going to have custody of children? And she said, well, they need to hear it. So I gave a talk and spoke from my heart, and that's how I always recommend anybody going to speak from your heart. Just spoke from my heart. And at the end of it, one of the judges of judges, he was like a chief judge.
Okay.
Because judges, some judges have oversight over other judges, like a supervising judge. He got up and he said, for 17 years, I've been doing probate work, and I've been a judge all these years. I've never heard that anyone recovered from major psychiatric problems. And he said, if I had known that, I would have made very different decisions on child custody cases. The reason that they don't give custody is often that they believe that people don't recover. So I think the more that we can get out there to judges, to teachers, to parents, to